I mean, if you try and take a real step back, right, the real challenge that we've got with the whole sustainability debate is that, well, that's all fine, but how are we going to pay for it? Or it's not going fast enough, or it's going too fast. How do I deal with all these risks when I've got a core business I need to run? And I think what we saw was that if you want to make something that's ecologically sustainable, adopted at scale, you need to make it financially sustainable.
So welcome to Leaders on a Mission, where we explore the journey of visionary leaders shaping the future of sustainability. Now, today I'm joined by Meersman, founding director of Zenobē. Now, Zenobē are a company really revolutionizing energy storage and electric mobility. And during this discussion, we're going to really dive into Zenobē's mission to accelerate the clean energy transition. And I can't wait to discuss the challenges of really scaling a rapidly evolving industry. It's quite amazing where Zenobē have got to really from, over the last 5 or 6 years. So really looking forward to exploring that and Stephen's insights on innovation partnerships and building a really resilient kind of company culture. And, so lots to get on with, Stephen. We could probably talk for hours. So, thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.
And maybe starting with thinking about what inspired you to, I suppose, co-found Zenobē, right? And
Well, it's a funny one because I always said I would never start a business and I would never do it with co-founders.
When did you come up with that one?
Well, I'd seen my family start a family business a few times and said this is far too much hassle, too much stress. But here I am, having started Zenobē with 2 co-founders, and it's been 8 years now that we've been on that journey. And I think I sort of got eased into it. So, I'm an engineer by background. Growing up in the family business, saw sort of that cutting edge between engineering and commercial or finance was quite interesting. So went to the US to do a business degree, then did consulting for a bit. Wanted to have more ownership, so moved into industry, joined Trafigura, looking after a set of refineries and import terminals for a bit. And that sort of eased me into where I am now, is that after leaving that last job, I was doing freelance consulting for a bit, which then meant I had some time for projects here and there, and started hearing a lot about batteries again. So after having been part of the team that helped set up AES Energy Storage in 2008 in the US, now Fluence, and helping do some fundraising for EOS Energy Storage in my spare time in 2011 or 12. Batteries came knocking again in Europe for the third time. So I thought, well, it's the third time, better do something properly with it this time. And the timing was really right in that the UK, my co-founder Nicholas, he'd built some of the first batteries on his land, co-located with solar. James Bass, my other co-founder, was one of the investors in that, and they were looking for some help from somebody who knew a thing about batteries. And James, a couple of years before that, had sold his consulting business to Oliver Wyman, so he asked around there and got referred to me. And so we had this opportunity to buy some existing assets and see if we could turn that from a project into a business. And then secondly, we were really at the start of this whole evolution in the UK. So it was a bit of timing, opportunity, and then the right team, with myself coming from engineering and trading, James knowing the utilities really well, and Nicholas knowing finance really well. We could really look at things across the silos, which has, I think, been the core part of the success of Zenobē, and keeping that going through the culture and the organization. That maybe it's like a bit like Dutch football, where you've got specialists, but they all learn to train or communicate with people who play the other positions. I think that sort of total football strategy has definitely been a key part of the Zenobē culture, although we all support different teams when it comes to real football.
Yeah, no, great. And so tell us a little bit about the key kind of problems that you're looking to kind of solve as it relates to kind of energy storage.
If you try and take a real step back, right? The real challenge that we've got with the whole sustainability debate is that, well, that's all fine, but how are we going to pay for it? Or it's not going fast enough, or it's going too fast. How do I deal with all these risks when I've got a core business I need to run? And I think what we saw was that if you want to make something that's ecologically sustainable, adopted at scale, you need to make it financially sustainable. And the other bit is that figuring out the right risk allocation so you can bring the right capital to the table is also really important. And I think that's where that engineering, consulting, finance approach was so critical. So I think from our side, it was really looking at that core problem on the grid, which is that we're slowly closing the coal plants because they're no longer economical. They're too expensive. They can't compete with wind. But that creates a new problem, this stability problem. So we were like, well, how do we solve that? How do we get enough capacity of that? And it turned out that it's not necessarily a policy problem. It was a financing and problem that really stood in the way of these assets being rolled out. So I think that's where that ownership mentality of saying, look, we'll own the whole thing, we'll design, build, own, operate, finance, really allowed us to look at things slightly differently.
Tell us a little bit about that kind of mission of, where do you see Zenobē?
Well, maybe it's worth to start where we are right now. So right now we've got a few business units, right? We've got the bit we started with, which is grid scale energy storage. We've got about 730 megawatts operating in the UK. A lot of that is in Scotland. And effectively what we're doing there is solving a first mile problem on the grid. We are helping electrons that are generated, wind in Scotland, get down south without overloading the wires. And we're trying to unlock capacity that's already there. That way we avoid having to build loads of new transmission lines, which people tend to not like in their backyard. And we're also making it cheaper for everyone involved. So that's great. The second business is on the EV fleet side is a bit of a last mile problem on the electricity grid, which is that if you put 200 transit buses in your backyard and you charge them all at the same time, that's the equivalent of about 1 to 2 Empire State Buildings of electrical load popping up in your garden. Now, the grid's not prepared for these huge spikes, even not when these people charge, when the grid is least used, right? Because they all charge at night. And the bus operators obviously are keen. They've got a very challenging business on the best of times, getting everyone to work in rain, sleet, through accidents, congestion, COVID, pandemics, etc. So what we saw was that, the banks weren't really coming in with funding. The OEMs weren't willing to take certain risks, neither were the operator. We could sort of come in and say, look, we'll be the single point of accountability for all these things. We'll design, build, fund, and thereby offer the charging as a service and the battery on the vehicle as a service. Now that then meant that actually it looked from the customer's perspective, the bank's perspective, and the OEM's perspective, like selling and operating another diesel bus, which is something that they've been doing very well for the last 100 years or so. So I think that's exciting on a micro level within the sector, but I think it's also exciting on a macro level, because if you look at buses and now also trucks, which we also do, they're the vehicles that do the most kilometers or miles of a lot of the vehicles on the road. So if you make those go green, it has an outsized impact on the environment. Also, there's only a few corporate clients that you have to convince to make that move, because it's quite concentrated, rather than having to convince loads of governments and stakeholders to go on this journey. So what we are now trying to do and continuing to do is convince these people that going ecologically sustainable is also the economical sustainable option. And one of the key pieces in that is the third business unit of Zenobē, which is our second life portable power business, where we repurpose old EV bus batteries in little boxes that look like diesel generators, but without the emissions and the noise. And we use them on film sets like we've done The Crown, Fast and the Furious, we did the actual Coronation, Extreme E, to reduce diesel generator usage on those sites, which has lots of benefits. And recently we've done something which was the logical next step there, which was with Massive Attack and Act 1.5 and that wider team. We've delivered, or were part of delivering, a nearly fully zero-emission festival, where our old EV bus batteries were powering the build-up, the breakdown, the make sure everybody's beers and other beverages were cold. But also we provided the buses with the help of our customers so that the last mile going from the train station to the festival was also zero emission. And we've done that all in a way that is economical and repeatable. And I think that's the exciting bit, is you get this snowball effect, right? Electrify the buses first, then you get big batteries back that can then be used to decarbonize other hard to decarbonize sectors, events, film, even construction now, where we've partnered with Select at Hinkley and Sizewell to actually build a nuclear power plant in a greener way, which is to some people possibly ironic. So that's the sort of stuff we get out of bed for, solving these difficult technical problems by translating them to a finance problem or changing a finance problem into a technical problem and having a massive outsized impact.
Awesome. And you started the business in 2017. So 2017. So, I mean, give me some sense. I mean, a couple of things there. 730 megawatts on the grid. What kind of size scope is that?
Oh, that's huge. I share some pictures. Right? If you look at it in a 40-foot container, people now get about, say, 8 megawatt hours maybe, right? So you can get an idea of how many 40-foot containers that is. So it's a few football pitches for sure. And then on the EV bus side, we've got probably about 1,500 electric buses on our balance sheet, which probably means we're the largest single owner of electric vehicles outside of Chile and China, which is quite a cool reference. And then we've now done our first electric truck project with Woolworths in Australia. We've also done some work with Renault and Sunny on the electric truck and the electric cement mixer side. So all these sort of niches in hard sectors, that's where we're looking to have an impact. Great.
Maybe I'd also just take it back a little bit around some of the, you mentioned this was the third wave of the battery, you know, when you first started looking at it. You know, what's kind of, I suppose, give me some insight around what had changed and where we are now on the battery kind of revolution.
Well, in 2008, when we did our first battery project, I mean, you couldn't even register it on the grid. We had to sort of pretend it was a 1 megawatt coal plant because there wasn't a box to tick on the form that said battery on the technology. The other one is batteries probably cost about 2 million something a megawatt hour in 2008 compared to now, probably closer to, below 200 a kilowatt, so 200,000, so a factor 10 less. Today. But the other bit is when we started, you had about maybe 10 megawatts tops connected to the UK grid in terms of batteries, and now it's over a gigawatt and a half. So, lots more, because I mean, we're about 10-15% of the market, I think. So it's gone quick. I mean, the market's evolved. I mean, we've grown quick, but the market's evolved very quick as well. I mean, the other bit is we're now also in Australia, New Zealand. We've just started an office in the US, and I've got a few first projects going there. I think the other bits we've seen is sort of the first shakeout, right? You had this sort of exuberant optimism when the market gets going. Then there's a few people who overextend and then collapse. And then there's a few people picking up the pieces, going at it again, but perhaps in a more measured pace. We've got obviously some tailwinds coming in as well, with people talking about delaying their mandates for EV and all these other things. So there's definitely a lot of noise around, and it's more apparent now who are the people talking about things and who are the people actually doing things. And I'd like to think we're one of the latter.
Yeah. It really is an evolving landscape, you know, in terms of very political as well, isn't it, really?
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, you try to stay out of that a little bit, right? So that's why I think from our side, the numbers got to work, right? For us, for the customer, for the supplier. And that's the way you're going to get mass adoption. Saying, we need subsidies, or, we could point out the huge subsidies going to the fuel sector with free parking, tax rebates on diesel, and policies for corporate cars and tax benefits and all that sort of stuff. So I don't necessarily think you need a lot of subsidies in the EV space today, or on the battery side today. A lot of it is policy needing to catch up with what the technology can do, right? Getting the customers to write their tenders or sufficiently aware that they can procure certain services rather than saying, oh, I'm going to buy a diesel bus because I've always bought a diesel bus, right? Let's just say I want a bus at the cheapest possible cost per kilometer, and let the vendors work out what the best technology for that is. Or don't say, oh, I always need to own my bus, or always need to own my battery power plant, or etc. Say, no, what is actually the service I want to procure? So that mindset shift and that dialogue between vendors, customers, and possibly people who are not even in the industry but are serving adjacencies is very important. I mean, if you look at what we're doing on the EV fleet side, when you said, okay, separating the battery on the bus from the charging infrastructure, that was quite novel when we did it. But they've been doing that with aircraft engines for decades, right? I mean, Lufthansa doesn't own their planes. They lease them in a wet lease from somebody else, who then leases them in a dry lease from somebody else, who then somewhere along the line somebody adds engine to the body and leases that as a package. So I think that's where what's quite exciting for us is that we were there at the start, and now a lot of other people are looking at that as well, is that a bus is a bit of an electric bus is a bit of a new asset class or a new type of infrastructure that's at a very exciting point in its lifetime.
Yeah. So how many electric buses are there in London then?
I think it's about 2,000 and a bit at the moment, out of the 9,000 and a bit.
Okay, and yeah, incredible progress. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. Just a couple of questions, first of all, right? I'm no expert in energy storage. When you spoke about capturing the energy from wind, for instance, in Glasgow, is that the main kind of source that you capture from, or do you capture from other sources as well?
No, I mean, mainly these things are connected to the grid, and you need to think of them a little bit as shock absorbers, emergency response units, last line of defense type assets, right? So the battery is not a generator.
Yeah.
Right? It can discharge, but then at some point it needs to charge again.
Yeah.
What you got to think of is on the electricity grid, I'm a mechanical engineer by background, so I find plumbing analogies work best for my simple brain. Is you've got all these different plumbing systems all connected, right? All these pipes and reservoirs, etc. Now the electricity grid actually didn't have those reservoirs. You just had pipes all connected. So if somebody put some more water in the piping system, it has to come out somewhere else. And that's really difficult to manage it like that. And the system operators did that. And that was easier when you had a few, maybe 10 or 20 thermal plants and lots of consumers at the other end of the wires. But when you then suddenly have loads of solar, loads of wind, etc., forget the fact that it varies during the day. It's also pushing the wrong way, because it's connected at where you usually only had consumers, and now suddenly there's producers there as well. So there's all these things happening on the network, and I think that's where grid scale storage comes in. It allows you to size your network differently, because before, if you look at a plumbing pipe, the amount of water it can carry is determined by its diameter, right? If you say, oh, I want more water to go through, the diameter needs to go. But the problem is, you don't always use the same amount of water all the time, or the same amount of electricity, right? In the evening, lots more people come home, turn on their kettle, turn on their electric oven, turn on their heating, etc., etc. And then you have a huge spike. So the pipes need to be big enough for that spike. But then the rest of the day, these assets are sitting there empty. And where storage comes in is you suddenly don't have to size your pipe based on the spike. You can size your pipe based on the average. So it provides a massive leverage effect and cost savings that eventually will pass through to consumers. But the utilities need to be able to buy that service, right? Before, they were being rewarded for how many pipes they put in the ground. So obviously they're not going to stop doing that if that's what they're being measured on. So that measurement system and policy making and target setting.
Has that started to change now as well?
No, it has started to change, and I think the UK has been one of the leaders in that space. It now just needs to make sure that it continues that. And you need more coordination, right? If you look at the bus sector, a lot of bus people wouldn't even know who, say, a couple of years back, wouldn't have known who Ofgem was, right, on the energy regulator. And now they're suddenly realizing, well, hold on, this is a big part of my cost base. I need to engage with this stakeholder. Similarly, Ofgem and the Department for Transport need to talk more, because you don't want to have situations where the DFT is handing out a subsidy for people to go electric, and then Ofgem's taking that money away again with changing how they, say, charge for how people get connected to the grid. That is actually happening at the moment, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, I mean, tell me, when you think about like the UK grid, for instance, right? Clearly there are huge demands put on it, but in terms of the demand required, how much and how quickly is that evolving and will evolve?
Well, if you look at the last several decades, power consumption actually has been going down on the UK grid, right? So you just got to put that into context. So there's quite a lot of spare capacity on the grid. It's just not equally distributed, right? If you're at the end of a line in the middle of an industrial, at the end of an industrial estate, somewhere in the middle of the country, well, the middle of the country might be fine, say the edges of the country, you may struggle to get capacity, right? Say you're a port terminal and you're trying to get 6 megawatts to start charging your ships electrically while they're in port so they can turn off their engines. You'll have a problem to get capacity. But overall, on the grid, there's loads of capacity. It's just that there's these key choke points because demand is popping up in new areas. And to put that into perspective, say at home, right, the peak power consumption of my house has probably gone from, say, 4 kilowatts to 25 as a result of me having an electric car. So the grid's very upset with me and charging me a penalty at the moment. So I need to look at, well, do I add storage to that? Or do I add some clever software where I don't charge that fast? So these decisions that I'm making individually, multiply them by the number of people in the country, multiply that by all the various companies, and then add the fact that we're all prisoners of geography to that. And you have choke points emerging.
Fascinating. It really is. Does it apply the same to like solar as well? Because you'd always heard with solar, like wonderful solution. But in terms of when it's at night time, it's not working, right? It's not effective. You're not able to kind of generate solar power, right? So
yeah, but people don't use that much. I mean, how much lights do you have on while you're sleeping in your bedroom?
Yeah.
So I think the point is there. It's a mix, right? It's not one. We should get away from these debates about, this singular technology is going to solve everything, right? It's a mix of things, right? You have solar, wind, and storage. If you look at all the consultants, all the engineers, all the specialists agree, it's the cheapest possible cost of engineering electricity, even if you factor in an overcapacity of storage into that mix.
Yeah,
right? Nuclear has no chance, etc. And the other thing is an interesting book I've been trying to read, which was very popular on the summer reading list, was How Big Projects Get Built, or whatever it was called. If you look at the cost overruns on an average solar plant, and you compare that with the cost overruns on a coal plant, or a transmission project, or a nuclear power project, I mean, you toss all these other three in the bin, right? Because the variability and the predictability on solar is so good, you know exactly what you're getting. While on these other projects, 14 years later and 3 times over budget, you might still not know where you're going to end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, though, the model, right? What I find interesting, the design, build, fund model, to do it when you did, it's very ambitious and expansive, right? Requires a huge amount of capital.
It does. And I think we were in a bit of a unique position, right? We were grid scale operators of batteries, so we liked owning batteries and a bit of kit around it. And it was actually through happenstance that we ended up having a conversation with, I ended up having a conversation with some people at Alexander Dennis and Stagecoach, who were sort of doing things with electric buses. And this was the early days of the market. And we sort of said, if you get loads of electric buses together, you're going to have this real grid issue and you might need to put a battery in the depot, etc., etc. Yeah, maybe in 10 years. And we never thought about it again. But we actually sketched out pretty much Zenobē's business model on an envelope, while on a random phone call sitting in one of our... I still remember I was walking around in our lawyer's offices because we were still at the point of setting up the business. And I'm like, okay, that's random. That's not thinking too much about it. And then 2 years later, we got a phone call back saying, Stephen, do you still have that napkin? Because it was there. We had our first project where they couldn't get connected to the grid because it was going to cost more than the buses. It was only a bottleneck at a few hours each night that caused the huge cost increase in the challenge. And we took a flyer on it, right? I mean, the board said, this is interesting, it's tangential, we're not spending too much time or too much capex on it at this point, let's give it a go. And the main concern for us was, can we turn this into a service and a long-term revenue stream? And the main challenge from the customer was, we were sitting in a big boardroom with the electricity provider, the utility, the vehicle OEM, the charger OEM, the electrical installer, the facilities manager, the operations manager at the client, etc. And we were going through all the various problems, and everybody was sort of pointing at each other, and we suddenly felt that, well, we were taking a bit the lead and pulling this together. And eventually the customer took me aside at one point and said, look, Stephen, if we write you one check, will you make it so that I never have to be in that meeting room? I said, well, not one check, but if you send us one check a month, we can probably make that happen.
Yeah. Was that the most complicated thing? Sitting around that table and listening to all the challenges and problems.
It's understandable, right? So if I tell you, you need to sell me insurance, right, on a charger, and you need to guarantee to me that it always works. If it doesn't work, I can charge you penalties. But you're not allowed to install it. You're not allowed to install any monitoring equipment on it, and you don't know which vehicle I'm going to use. You're going to make that very expensive, right? And that's what's happening, is you have so many different steps in the value chain, and everybody needs to price and risk, rather than saying, look, let's put all the risk on the table, right? And we figure out who's best placed to take which law. And that's where the ownership and the financing is so critical, because it allows you to say, well, yes, dear customer, I am aligned with you because I'm guaranteeing the service. And also I own the assets, or we co-own the assets, depending on what structure. So we are going to look after it. We're both interested, and to use a horrible Dutch expression, our noses are pointing in the same direction, right? Like we're both got the same goal in mind. And that's really, again, why that finance, consulting, and engineering had to come together to allow us to break down the silos and look for the global optimum rather than the local optimum inside each box.
Yeah. Tell me, how much money have you kind of raised in that period of time?
It's actually embarrassing. I don't even know anymore. In terms of an exact figure. But if you look at it, the last capital raise was about another £600 million of equity. We'd probably done about £300 million before. And then we're just around £1 billion of debt as well, in terms of on top of the equity. So you're approaching the somewhere between 1 and the 2 billion, closer to the latter number.
But it's just, it's unbelievable. And
yeah, but a diesel bus, a double deck bus easily costs $500,000. Right?
Does it? Okay, $500,000. Wow. Okay.
And it then costs the same amount again to keep it running for another year, for another 10-15 years.
But I think the thing is, it's the mechanism for funding is an interesting one. We're so used to startups kind of, being plumbed by a venture funding, and that's not going to work here. You're straight into kind of private equity.
Yeah, we need a fish no fire, because for private equity we were too small and too unproven. For venture capital we were too asset intensive, and for the infrastructure funds it was all too merchant, right? Too volatile.
Okay, so how did you solve that problem? Because
Well, it turns out we have lots of friends who are more successful than us. So we got them to give us money and invest, basically. So we raised about £25 million of capital from friends, family acquaintances, over a 9-month period, which was exhausting.
Yeah, that's a huge amount. That's a huge amount. 25 million through friends and family.
Yeah, this is where it's really good to work out that all your friends and acquaintances are more successful than you. But at the end of that 9-month period, it was just taking too much time away from the business. And we had been speaking to a few private equity parties. So then we accepted about a £20 million investment from Tiger Infrastructure, a New York-based fund that actually had, at the time, was talking to invest in a friend of mine's startup. He got the bigger deal, but we closed quicker, so we haven't quite agreed on.
Well, win-win. It sounds like a win-win. And the investment interest in decarbonisation, though, right? Clearly, the solution you're offering here, like overall, in terms of what you're looking to do, there's a drive around renewable. There's a drive around decarbonisation. I'm wondering if the acceptance and the interest of funds and money, helped with that.
Well, I would say I don't want to give a depressing message, but I think it's important to be realistic about this, is that a lot of people from the investment community say they're interested in decarbonization and such, but I find that people mean a lot of different things by that. I mean, if you're a fund and you're charging your investors more fees to set up a green investment vehicle, are you looking at a business opportunity, or are you trying to do something that's good for the environment, right? If you demand the same returns from a greener investment than from, say, a coal plant, again, are you truly interested in the next few generations, or are you again just going after the next opportunity? And I think there's very different people with very different perspectives in that investor community.
Tell me what have been, like, when you think about the challenges, right? And you think about the journey. What do you think have been the most, the real kind of most significant challenges that you've kind of faced?
The flavor of them changes day by day, I would say. But I think the big challenge is obviously team, right? Getting the right team together, getting them motivated, getting all their noses pointing in the same direction. And particularly in a fast evolving market where, you need to course correct and tackle so that you catch the wind and keep yourself moving forward, but at the same time that you're not getting blown away off course. So getting that balance right, I think, is very important. And that requires a lot of time and communication, particularly as the organization gets larger, right? When we were 12 people sitting in an office meant for 4 people, everybody knew what everybody else was doing, and that was very easy. When you went from 23 people to 86 during COVID, and you couldn't meet each other, that was a lot harder to keep that culture. Same with the shareholder and the alignment, right? Understanding how to efficiently manage that communication, but at the same time have enough time for the business, I think, is another tension point, and that goes in waves throughout the journey. And I think thirdly is not getting sucked up in the now, right? You need to really have the time for moments of reflection and looking forward. So I think having the time that we invested in raising funding from the banks, thanks to Nicholas's background and insistence, we spent a lot of time with them in the initial stages, very uncertain game, right? Because the investment amounts were tiny, below sort of bank's interest. We were then trying to do something new, which is always difficult. But the fact we took them along on the journey meant that we were able to do the amounts that we've been able to do now is basically compound interest on that early investment in 2016 and 17, trying to explain them that a battery is actually a little bit like a diesel generator, and getting a lot of doors slammed in our face, right? I think that was a big learning.
Very interesting challenges. Tell me, what about the international component? And I'm wondering whether that kind of stretches things when you think about culture and people, because clearly you're a very international company, right? So, US, UK, you mentioned Australia, New Zealand. I mean, where else are the ambitions?
Well, going to Australia and New Zealand in the middle of COVID, when you can't send someone there, you need to be a bit like MacGyver on the phone, explain to your locally hired team how to install a bus depot. Wouldn't recommend that for your first international expansion, but we did it. You got to follow the customer, right? I mean, everybody talks about sort of top-down strategies and finding blue oceans and all that sort of stuff. That's all great, but you got to make cash, right? You got to make revenue in order to survive and continue to be on that journey, right? So I think that realism is really important, and that sense of practicality combined with a bit of a strategic vision, I think that's a challenge. Now, for us, we've really followed the customer, right? So we said our strategy is very simple, right? We focus on electrical islands, right? The UK is an island, Australia is an island. The US might not look like an island, but if you look at its electrical grid, it's a collection of islands. where we could do grid services to provide that sort of link between energy and transport. But there's a clear mandate, obviously, for what we're trying to do, or a clear problem. And we're a B2B business, and we only follow our customers, right? We will never go into a country where we're not following a customer or a supplier or a financial partner, and preferably all three. So that gives you the focus, right? It's not sort of out of these 196 countries, there's these 7 criteria, and or like GDP, number of whatever. No, it's very much where have you got an outsized right to win and make an impact.
Yeah.
So that means that suddenly Australia, US, and Belgium can be in the same club, which it isn't always obvious when you start the conversation with someone.
So how many people work at the company now?
I think we're just around 300 now.
Okay, so 300, and in terms of how do you go around that? I mean, one thing I hear a lot of from people when they're growing, and you mentioned it before, 12 people, 23, even 86 to a certain degree is a lot of adjustment. But when you got 300, you're not going to know everyone's name for sure. How do you ensure...
We only hire Tims. We solve that way. No. Yeah.
How do you ensure the cultural kind of alignment on, your kind of values and what you stand for, and how you kind of operate is kind of duplicated as the company scale?
Unless you're sick of saying something, don't assume people have heard you, is one piece of advice I would give. You really need to invest and make sure you've got these evangelists or real carriers of the banner in the team. So crafting that culture early and then making sure these people then spread the word. I would say we're still dealing with some of the indigestion that COVID gave us in our culture as a result of going from 23 to 86 in that period, right, where you couldn't see each other. And making sure you get informal networks, right? We spent a lot of time during COVID and after COVID making sure people built up networks outside of their core little bubble. I don't think we're doing enough. We're doing more than other people, so maybe never get that balance right. So yeah, I think there's more we can do, but those are sort of things we've tried and we found work well, or that we found people respond well to.
And any particular tips around that? The building, I love hearing how people do it. What's worked well for you, building the informal network?
Well, nothing's worse than organized fun. So I think giving people the autonomy to organize stuff, right? So what we did is we encouraged people to get random lottery, 5 people get put together and say, look, here's your budget, do something, right? And let them work it out rather than saying, oh, we're all going, I don't know, rope skipping or whatever. And doing it in small enough groups so that people can actually have a proper conversation that goes a bit deeper. And then balancing that with the sort of all hands events where you give people an update on the business and allow them to ask questions. So you've got to have the balance of both the formal and the informal small group bits. I think trying to do the organized fun in large groups never works.
No, it just sounds like the larger you get, obviously, is it like the larger you get, the more percentage of your time you need to spend on internal activities as opposed to kind of external? Is there a percentage or is there a ratio that kind of you have in mind?
I don't know if you ever get that right.
Right.
I think it depends a lot on how flat or hierarchical an organization is, or how specialized versus how generalist. I think it's hard to come up with a magic rule there.
Yeah. And what about like in terms of your thinking just about your employee proposition, right? In terms of, why do people come and work for Zenobē, and what do you offer to those people that come and join?
Well, I think 2 things, right? I mean, obviously, you have to reward people, and it's a competitive market out there. But I think the biggest thing is the mission, right? People really buy into that we're trying to make a difference and we're doing something that someone should be doing. I think that's important. And I think the other bit that I think historically helped us a lot was that it was a founder-led business, right? And from the the freshest intern to me or my two colleagues, there weren't a lot of steps in between. I think that also makes a difference. So we had a lot of people who brought in other people, right? The sort of, like, sorry to go back to tropes and stereotypes, but good people know good people. So trying to use these informal networks to pull people in, so that, again, whether it's going to be fit or not is important.
Great, yeah, absolutely. And just final question for me, right? When you look at Zenobē in the next 5 or 10 years, right? Well, what are the long term? I know you're probably thinking about tomorrow rather than 5 or 10 years, but what are the long term kind of goals and aspirations, do you think, for the business?
I think in a market that evolves this quickly, it's very hard to come up with a 5 to 10 year forecast, right? We live in very uncertain times now, even more so than 10 years ago, I would say. So you've got to remain flexible. I think the biggest thing for us is having and strengthening that sort of initial sense of wonder and curiosity and drive to say, look, we're going to be the battery experts and the best at helping people who have batteries in their value chain somewhere, and knowing this asset better and offering value, and then hopefully keeping a little bit of that value we create, and that can-do attitude where somebody says, oh, this is completely impossible, and then it's like, give me 30 minutes, and then comes back with well, we can't do this, but we can do that. And that sort of attitude, keeping that, if you can do that over the next 5 to 10 years and strengthen that, and obviously balance that with process and focus, that'd be really quite impressive. Second thing is, well, we've got quite big ambitions, right? It's doubling, tripling on an annual basis, which is important. If you do that, that'd be great. And then thirdly, I think challenging people's preconceptions of what's possible and what isn't possible, right? I've got some friends on the venture capital side, and they're saying, well, lots of people pitching saying they want to be the next Zenobē. Well, that's great, not from an ego perspective, but from the fact that even if you look at the amounts of capital that we've raised to date, it's a drop on a hot plate, right? I mean, 2 billion on, saw some numbers at what we need to raise, 64 trillion or whatever it is to meet all the commitments that people have made by 2030, ignoring what's actually required, which is a multiple of that again. I mean, I might not have got those numbers exactly right, but the point is, even if it's 64 billion, well, 2 billion is 1/30th. It's nothing. So we need other people to sort of follow in these footsteps and not make it too easy for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, look, Stephen, I could chat all day with you about this, and I think the thing to say is just thanks for sharing a very inspiring journey. Really is, and just your insights on the future of kind of clean energy, a really thought-provoking discussion, and so thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
And well, look, to our listeners as well, thanks for tuning in to this week's Leaders on a Mission. Be sure to subscribe for more engaging conversations with industry leaders.